Welcome to fourth species counterpoint, the suspension. Here, the third and final dissonance in these exercises will be introduced. As you can see here, we have a perfect consonant interval of an octave going to an imperfect consonant interval of a third. You can also see it's traveling in contrary motion. A suspension occurs when the counterpoint is shifted over a half measure. This is now written as a tied half note instead of a whole note, because as you can see, now the note is suspended into the next measure. It's still the same length of note though, but now because it's going into the next measure, it's going to be a tied note. Notice how the syncopation creates a new interval from the original 1-to-1 ratio. Before we had an octave going to a third, and now we have an octave where the top voice is suspended into the next measure, where a sixth is created, and then that's going to a third. This is known as a syncopated suspension because the suspension begins on the weak beat of the measure. Lengthening is another type of suspension where the original duration of the note is just lengthened into the next measure. In other words, suspending into the next measure where you can see it is creating another interval from the original note. Still at full length duration, and then just half of it is being suspended over into the next measure, as you can see. And you can also have tone repetition where the tone is just repeated into the next measure where it's creating that different interval. So the notes aren't tied together, but the notes are just repeated. And as you can imagine, this half note creating this octave could also be a whole note above the whole note here. And then you could just have the note repeating the tone repetition here, creating the suspension as well. The note that's staying the same is suspending from the first interval over to the next interval. This explains why in the 2-to-1 exercises and on, repeated notes were not allowed, because they'd be creating suspensions, but now we're learning how to use suspensions. So it's just the fact that they weren't allowed in those exercises because those exercises were isolating examples and the suspension had not been introduced yet. Because now we're in fourth species where this is an isolated example of the suspension. So you'll see that the main goal of our exercises is going to be creating as many suspensions as possible. So if you didn't notice, that was a consonant suspension, and then from that interval created from the suspension, it then goes to a imperfect consonants. Consonant suspensions are very useful. They help us do things that normally would sound like bad voice leading. So on line 2, you can see a pair of accented parallel perfect fifths on the downbeats. So of course, this is normally something that would be prohibited. But as you can see, the fifths occurring on the downbeats are the results of the suspended note before it. Because these two parallel fifths are products of suspended notes, furthermore, they are formed between a well-established sixth interval, it is fine. So I'm going to have a half note rest here because this interval that it's creating with this note is irrelevant. It's just the fact that this note is suspending into this measure, you have a fifth on the downbeat, and then the same thing happening again, so you have a suspended note on the next downbeat creating a fifth, so you have those parallel fifths on the downbeat. Normally you'd think that's something that you wouldn't want, but the consonant sixth interval obscures the melody enough for us to be distracted from the parallel fifths. But this also has to do with the fact that this is a syncopated suspension occurring from the weak beat going to the strong beat. So the syncopation results in the downbeat not being as accented as it would be in other exercises, where the note is landing on that downbeat instead of the note being suspended into the downbeat with a tie. So you might think having the two parallel fifths on the downbeats is something that you probably want to avoid, and it's probably not going to be something that you're going to strive to do, but you're going to notice 5/6 and 6/5 patterns are very common occurrences in 18th century music, and oftentimes they're serving as a way to avoid parallel fifths. Consonant suspensions can also mask over an underlying voice leading error. So remember, when you have a case where you have some parallel fifths, remember the suspension. Before moving on, let's examine one thing, and that's the fact that we created the parallel fifths from the suspension. So originally we had two pairs of sixths, but in the syncopated suspension example, this top note in the first interval is moved over to the weak beat in the meter. And because it's a whole note, 4 beats, it's moved over those 2 beats, to where then it's a whole note, but it is suspended from the weak beat of the measure to the downbeat of the next measure. Because of that, the original sixth interval occurs in the middle of the measure. So you can see here it's just creating the sixth over here, and it's creating the fifth in the next measure with the original sixth, but because this note is now suspending into this measure, it's creating a fifth, as you can see right here. And the original note where it came from is irrelevant. It's just the fact that before all that, we have the fifth on the downbeat from the suspended note coming from the syncopated weak measure before. So the point of that is that we have two parallel fifths on the downbeats, but originally we started with two sixth intervals. But the notes were just shifted over halfway into the measure, creating that syncopated suspension. Okay, so now what happens if originally in the 1-to-1 ratio of notes we have two parallel octaves or two parallel fifths? So normally parallel perfect intervals are going to be prohibited no matter where they are in the meter. But if that original note creating the interval is moved over and syncopated, creating a suspension, then that suspended note is going to create a different interval in the next measure, or in other words, in the next interval that it is intersecting with. So because of this, it can mask the parallel perfect intervals. But in order to do this, it must be a consonant interval. So in this case, the consonant sixth creates enough of an obscurity in the motion of the parallel octaves to be able to block it. Enough that it is acceptable and okay. But a little bit more on that in a second. So we can have the same thing with originally parallel fifths in that 1-to-1 ratio. They are masked as long as that consonant suspension is formed between them. So these examples are acceptable in these exercises, but in a real-life situation, it's good to know that these parallel perfect intervals are only going to be masked when you have 3 and especially 4 voices. With only 2 voices, all of the attention is going to be on them, so the parallel octaves and fifths become too conspicuous. Because of this, if you're in a real-life situation, these should only be used rarely if you only have 2 voices. Syncopations can also be used to create dissonant intervals. In the case of a dissonant suspension, we're going to identify it by marking a dash between the interval that is creating the suspension and the note that it is resolving to. And of course, you can see here this is talking about the number representing the interval. So this would be a 4-3 suspension identified with that dash in between it. So here we have a fifth going to a third. So when that note is suspended, it now creates a suspension of a fourth on the downbeat. Forming dissonant suspensions must follow 3 rules, also known as PSR. So first you have to prepare the note, then you have to suspend the note, next you have to resolve the note, and I'm going to explain this. But let's first note that in these exercises, when you resolve, you're always going to be resolving down a step. So since we're using syncopation to create the suspension in these exercises, P and S are always going to be the same note. So in other words, the note that you prepare for your suspension and the suspended note are always going to be the same note, since originally you just took that first note and now you syncopated it, suspending it into the next measure, which you see right here. So we have that preparation of the suspension, and then we have the suspension itself, so PS. In these exercises, we have 2 rules for the suspension. The dissonance must be prepared by a consonant on the previous upbeat. So our prepared note has to be a consonant interval. So let's just break that down one more time. P and S are the same note. In other words, prepare and suspend. Your prepared note has to be that consonant interval from the upbeat before it. So the previous interval. Next, the dissonance must resolve down a step to a consonant on the next upbeat. So at the end of this video, I'm going to talk about the PSR method a little bit more, how you can use it outside of these counterpoint exercises when thinking about something just like chords, suspending notes in a chord. So I don't want to interrupt the flow of this video, so look out for that at the end of the video. And of course, this video will be timestamped, so if you want to find that look in the description or fast forward and there should be chapters dividing each section. The most common types of dissonant suspensions that we're going to be using are the 4-3, the 7-6, and the 11-10 suspensions. These suspensions are the best for composing above a given melody because they're resolving to imperfect consonant intervals. So remember, your suspension, your 4-3 suspension is a 4-3 suspension because that 4 is the dissonant note that is being suspended, and the 3 is the note that it's resolving to. So as you can see, the note that is preparing it is irrelevant other than the fact that it must be a consonant interval and it must be the same note as the suspended note. Which again in these exercises is a given since we're syncopating to create our suspension. But as you can imagine, let's say we're using the repeated note. And we weren't actually syncopating this note, we were just repeating a note. So in that case, it's good to remember you have to prepare, suspend, and resolve. Prepare and suspend are the same note, and you resolve a step away in these exercises down a step to a consonance. And of course, more on tying this into chords at the end. Here we have more dissonant suspensions, and we're still working above the given melody. But in this case, the dissonant suspensions are resolving to a perfect consonance. So this is not as good. Here we have a 9-8 suspension. This is less effective and sounds harsher because being the same note, the given melody anticipates the resolution tone, along with the resolution harmonizing with the first overtone of the given melody, which can create a dull sound, which we just learned that we can mask in some situations. But in this case, you're resolving right to an octave, and it's not being suspended, syncopated, it's just landing right on that note. So being by itself, it's more emphasized. So building from there, let's change the consonant interval before it, so we have 2 octaves being surrounded by this dissonant suspension. In this case, the dissonance does not mask the parallel motion enough. So this would not be allowed at all. This would be considered an error. So again, originally not being surrounded by the parallel octaves on the upbeats, this is allowed, but it's not as good. It's not going to be something you're striving to put in your exercises or your finished compositions at that. And this is just something you're altogether going to avoid. Again, it has to do with the fact that you're suspending this note, but the note that it's landing on is that parallel perfect interval with the other upbeat, but it's not being syncopated and tied into. It is existing as a shift from the last note. So it's not going to hide the parallel motion enough, because furthermore, you're going to hear the octave being sounded on this upbeat as the suspension, but it's going to be the note that's changing in the counterpoint from the previous note. And then the next note that's changing in the counterpoint from the previous note again is the other octave. So it's easier to remember these things when we can make sense of it. Moving on, we could have a dissonant 2-1 suspension. This is possible, but it's not as appealing since the given melody again is anticipating the resolution tone. In this case, it's the same exact note. So not as good, but that doesn't mean not allowed or an error. It just means not as good for voice leading. So it's good that we have things that are not as good because it allows us to have more options. It's just saying that, okay, if we're able to, let's pick a better option, of course. So as we can see, dissonant suspensions can resolve to perfect consonances, but it's not as useful or not as good as resolving to the imperfect consonances from that dissonant suspension. So remember, we're only moving down a step from our dissonant suspensions. We'll go back to the consonant suspensions and analyze them more in a little bit, but just the note that leaving from a consonant suspension, you don't have to go down a step, but you do have to go to a consonant interval. Or if you think about chords and interval in the chord, but more about chords at the end. The best suspensions when writing below a given melody are the 2-3 and 9-10 suspensions, since they resolve to an imperfect consonance, with the 4-5 suspension not being as good since it is resolving to that perfect consonance. The 7/8 suspension in a lower voice should be avoided completely. It has a very harsh sound to it, so much so that in many textbooks it is considered an actual error. So keep in mind that this could be an error. No 7/8 suspensions. Write it down somewhere. Something. We have some cadence formulas. These go along with Fuchs's approach and the exercise methods that we've been going over. There'll be a section at a point of this video after showing you Fuchs's method, along with Haydn's Cantus Firmus and a response by Beethoven. We're going to see another exercise that's going to follow all the same rules, but it's going to add a few more rules outside of what Fuchs taught, but all things that you're going to find throughout Bach's music. So it's still staying within those parameters. Okay, and with that, we're going to have 2 more cadence options. So if you don't watch the full video, just know we're going to have 2 more cadence options. It'll be timestamped somewhere at the end of this video. But if you watch any video all the way through, I would recommend it would be the counterpoint videos, because these are videos that you should take rather slowly. The whole point of the Species Counterpoint is breaking down each method, isolating each method, and being able not to just memorize these methods and memorize them really good, but also to understand them. When you understand something, you don't have to think about memorizing something because you can just make sense of it. So that's also why I'm trying to explain some of this stuff here, because it's good not to just say, okay, we can't do parallel octaves, but to say, we can't do parallel octaves because of this reason. Okay, so moving on, in the third to last measure approaching the cadence, we're going to be using a 7/6 suspension to an octave when writing above, and a 2/3 suspension to a unison when writing below. In the end of method 1, what we're going over here right now, you're going to see that Mozart chooses a different approach to his cadence, or in other words, a different cadence formula. But this has to do with the fact that he put himself into a corner that he had to figure out how to get out of. Okay, last thing to touch on before moving on to an analyzation of an exercise. So I didn't label the intervals here. No, I'm not being lazy, because what we're paying attention to here is the notes and the key or mode that we're in. In this case, we're in D Dorian, and that's why we have a C sharp. That's the raised 7th degree of this mode, creating the leading tone. And before the leading tone occurs, it is approached by the tonic. And then furthermore, after that, it goes back to the tonic. Being surrounded by the tonic and simultaneously being in a mode that contains a chromatically raised leading tone creates an increase in tension that can sound random in context. So here we have a voice leading issue. So what could we do here? And this is where a dissonant suspension is going to come in. So this answers the question of why should we use a dissonant suspension? We can use them to help motivate passages of difficult voice leading. In this example, there is a 2-voice cadence in the Dorian mode, using the standard raised leading tone. The leading tone is the 7th degree, and it's a tendency tone that has the tendency to rise up a step. So let's say we're stuck in a position to where we're approaching this by the tonic note, extending the tonic into the next downbeat where it creates a dissonant suspension, turns scaled degree 1 into a local dissonance. So now the motion of a step going to scale degree 7 is actually going to sound like a decrease in tension versus an increase in tension, since we're creating that dissonance here, and you can see we're creating a 7th. And as you might know, a chordal 7th is another tendency tone, and in this case it wants to resolve down a step. So this plays into multiple things, a common occurrence in counterpoint, where you're doing one thing and it can be explained in many different ways, hopefully all agreeing, making it good voice leading, and making it a solid decision. So this is how you use a dissonant suspension to motivate passages with difficult voice leading. So when you're wondering, why am I going to use a dissonant suspension? Just think of passages that have voice leading issues that are difficult to resolve. Here we have a Cantus Firmus by Haydn. This is his variation of Fuchs's Dorian Cantus Firmus. Haydn studied from and taught out of Fuchs's book Gradus ad Parnassum, and this appears to be his variation of Fuchs's original Dorian Cantus Firmus. This is Beethoven's syncopated counterpoint melody to Haydn's given melody. Let's listen to it and then analyze it. Okay, the first thing to do would be to label the intervals and mark a dash between the dissonant suspensions, which I already did. And to make it a little easier just to read the interval numbers, as you can see, the intervals go and then there's the dissonant suspension and it's a flat sort of line. But when you have a case where the end of one dissonant suspension doesn't create the beginning of another dissonant suspension, you'll notice the space between the intervals and how it's going from one spot to another. So that's just showing you that this dissonant suspension doesn't keep going in a chain, but you do have more suspensions, and you can see they're consonant suspensions. So you can easily spot the consonant suspensions and then the dissonant suspensions, and this will come in handy for the other example too, which is going to be good because that one's going to be in minor. Beethoven's response is a great example because the melody on its own is a well-formed melody that uses a variety of dissonant suspensions. So in this case you can see the 7/6 and the 4/3, and also he does not use very many in direct succession, which in this exercise and what Jacob Gran is teaching is that it's a common problem in many suspension exercises to have the same suspensions directly occurring one after another. But in the next exercise, we're going to see that this is something that some people actually strive for. So there's two different mindsets there. I'm going to offer both of them so we can give both of them a listen, while also along the way learning about minor in the next one. But then we can figure out, okay, should we be creating what would be called a chain of dissonant suspensions occurring directly one after another. Okay, so here in method 1, we're going to be thinking about that as a problem, something that we're not going to be striving for. Notice in measures 8 and 9 how Beethoven breaks the pattern of syncopation which are creating the suspensions. So when we arrive to this note B, it's no longer tied to another note. It's no longer acting like a syncopation because of that. And as you can see, the note after it just goes to a consonant interval of an A, and then from there we leap up a fourth to D. We're allowed to break the pattern of suspension once and at most twice. The reasons are to halt the descent of the counterpoint, to improve the melodic line, and to avoid an error. So you can see the line below goes from measure 6, and it rethinks it if it did the suspensions the whole way to the cadence. So if Beethoven did continue the suspensions, then he would have had a melody that kept descending down all the way to the cadence. And this actually starts before this on the upbeat of measure 4. So from here we'd be going all the way down to the final cadence, just going down the entire way. This would create 3 4/3 suspensions in a row, something we're trying to avoid in method 1. And probably most importantly, the melody would end without melodic closure on scale degree 1. We always want the listener to know that this is the end. So this is why we create the cadence. Most of the time, once you create a chain of dissonant suspensions, there are no opportunities to get off the chain unless you are able to find a consonant suspension somewhere. The only time Beethoven's melody ascends is directly after a consonant suspension. When Beethoven breaks the chain of suspensions, it allows him to create the interval of a third on the next downbeat, so that from there he can leap up to a spot in the scale where the melody must be to create the final 7/6 cadence. If Beethoven knew he had to create the dissonance, then why did he not just work backwards from the ending to avoid having to break the suspension? Composing backwards is good thinking and can come especially in handy when composing for suspension exercises. Using a chain of 7/6 suspensions here would not work, because when working backwards, once getting to the note F, it's not able to be prepared as a consonance over the E in this measure, since it will form a dissonant ninth. The chain of dissonant suspensions would set up the correct notes to nicely create a chain of dissonances that run all the way to the final note, since the 7/6 suspension cadence formula is used for counterpoint written above the given melody. But as you can see, there's no way to create this chain of suspensions. Therefore, Beethoven chooses to break the syncopation, which allows him to relocate the register of the suspension. Instead of creating an analytic diagram, try instead creating a rhythmic reduction. This will reduce it to a 1-to-1 ratio, except for the circumstance where you might break the suspension. In that case, you're going to see a 2-to-1 ratio in that measure. In other words, you're going to unsyncopate the notes. Your rhythmic reduction might contain voice leading errors such as parallel perfect intervals, but if your rhythmic reduction does not contain errors, like we see here in the rhythmic reduction of Beethoven's response, you're going to know that this is going to create voice leading, and then you can expect that your suspension exercise will most likely have good voice leading as well. Here are 6 counterpoint examples composed over Fuchs's Cantus Firmus, including Fuchs's response and Mozart's too. And you actually get 2 different Fuchs. Here's where you can analyze Mozart's choice of cadence. Analyze each response and make a conclusion of which one executes the exercise the best and which one is the worst, and furthermore, why you think this. Remember to consider everything rhythmically reduced. Next is another example of an exercise, but this time in minor. Again, we're using suspensions and all the rules from before apply, but this time we're going to include a few more things that we can do. These are not included in Fuchs's book, but are in a different treatise that follows rules that are found in Bach's compositions. In this exercise, I'm going to offer a different perspective to the realization. This time, our goal will be to create a chain of dissonant suspensions, unlike before where it was avoided. If the given melody allows for a chain of dissonant suspensions, then you should try that out. We are treating the notion of repeating the same suspension over and over again as not a problem. This will allow us to make the conclusion for ourselves if we think this is something you would want to do or not. A reason why you would not want to do this is directly repeating the same interval over and over might lead to a form or sense of motivity or expectation in your counterpoint exercise, which is something that you generally do not want in at least your exercises. Also, there might just be more interesting conclusions that aren't repeating the same thing over and over, but it's good to keep an open mind and see for yourself, because sometimes you could be surprised. You think, oh, repeating might create something boring, but who knows, maybe when you compare it to the original one, it actually turns out to be more interesting. Again, we are syncopating everything, so we're actually creating a suspension out of everything, and it's colliding with the next note, creating a whole new interval. So with that, the conclusion will definitely be different than if we just had a pattern of notes that weren't suspended and syncopated, that were all doing the same thing in every single measure. So again, make your own conclusion. The counterpoint being written below must start on the tonic. This creates an octave, which gives us a dissonant suspension of a second. The second resolves to a third, so we have a 2-3 suspension. The third is then the consonance that prepares the dissonance of the upbeat of measure 3. But in this case, we can see that the dissonance resolves upwards. When this occurs, this is known as a retardation. So this is something that's not allowed or mentioned in some books, including Fuchs's, but this allows us to have more options when creating our suspension. But there are rules to this. This can only occur in minor keys, and this happens when the leading tone is the dissonance in the suspension. So you see the leading tone being the dissonance in the suspension, the leading tone having that tendency to want to rise a step, having the leading tone against scale degree 3 in minor is a sound that Bach includes in his music quite often. You can see it all over his scores. In bar 4, we have a consonance, which means that the chain of dissonant suspensions ends. In this circumstance, ask yourself what note acts as both a consonant preparation with the given melody, but also acts as the dissonant suspension in the next measure. That would be the note E. E prepares what is going to turn into a chain of 2-3 suspensions. This E might seem like it is implying a 6-4 chord, but in fact, in the case of suspensions, the harmony can change within the same bar. So this instead would imply a root position A minor chord and a root position E major chord, 2 chords in one bar. This E creates a small chain of 2-3 suspensions, which is then broken with an octave of Cs. We don't have the resources to create another chain of 2-3 suspensions, so what could we do? When the cantus does not allow for a continuous chain of suspensions, we should still keep the suspensions going, while trying to add dissonant suspensions where we can. In bar 7, there's a change of harmony within one measure. C major moves to F major. This doesn't set up a consonance for a dissonant suspension in the next bar, but it still keeps the syncopation of the next consonant suspensions apparent. In measure 8, F leaps up an octave to another F, which maintains F major. This allows the 4-5 suspension in the penultimate measure, creating a 5-1 cadence. We could have also ended with this. Remember, there's going to be the 2 more additional cadences at the end. Here from measure 8, F moves up a third to A, where it creates an octave below the given melody. This creates a 9th with the next upbeat, which is then resolved down a half step to G sharp, the raised leading tone creating a 9-10 suspension before the cadence. G sharp then rises back up to A, creating a cadence with the leading tone. Okay, so pretty obvious, but it's good to point out the fact that when you're writing your counterpoint above the given melody and you have a dissonant suspension, since it's majority of the time going down that step, your suspension above is always going to be going down. So if you have a dissonant 4 suspension, it's going down to a 3 to be resolved. But when you're below the given melody and you're writing your counterpoint, then it has the opposite effect. So like in this case, we have a dissonant 9th being suspended, and that resolves down. But since it's going down from the same note, and it's below, now the number is going up 1. So it goes from a 9 to a 10. Just something good to think about. Okay, here we have 2 more cadence options when using 10ths and 12ths below a given melody. Of course, your 10th and especially your 12th are something you're not going to want to be using unless you have a bass to tenor voice. A bass to tenor voice going above an octave is not a problem. You find this a lot, even in Bach's music. Sometimes a lot more than an octave, but in these cases, and a general consensus for the counterpoint exercises, is that you can stay within the parameters of a compound fifth between your bass and your tenor, but all other voices, your soprano, alto, and tenor, must be within an octave of each other, not more than that. So I would recommend practicing this in your exercises, getting used to that pattern of thought from the beginning. This is not something you find in Fuchs's method. Okay, so now for the exercises, we have Haydn's variation of Fuchs's D Dorian Cantus, re-realized in C major. I just think it's a really good cantus that highlights the scale very well. And then we also have the A minor Cantus Firmus from the minor exercise found in method 2 of this video. So we have one in major and one in minor. I took Haydn's re-realized cantus, now in major, and I transposed it to A major and B flat major. And you have 2 choices to complete this exercise, and they're both good practice. You might also just want to do both. And that would be 1 you can treat your counterpoint like an alto voice below your soprano voice. So you can treat this melodic line like a soprano line with an alto voice harmonizing below it, or you could still think of it as a soprano voice, but instead you could be thinking about writing in a bass voice below it. So then for that, you could be practicing writing and reading in the bass clef, while also having that difference of bass to soprano, which a lot of times is something you're going to be doing when you actually get to composing, when you want to have a bass line and write a melody over it, and then after that you can fill in the voices, a very common method of 4-part harmony. So of course that applies for both of these, but you just have 2 different keys. Okay, next, same thing, A major above, B flat major above. It's the same melody, now it's just in the bass line, acting like a bass voice. So again, you have 2 options, but in this case, you could be practicing either writing in your tenor line, and with that, throwing in your tenths and your twelfths, or in other words, your compound thirds and fifths, while also writing and reading in the bass clef. And 2, you could be thinking about writing in your soprano line for your counterpoint. So of course then you'd be writing up here in the treble clef in the soprano range. And again, both are good practice. Okay, now the same idea here, but now we have minor, we have B minor, and we have C minor. Again, choose to either write your response in the alto range for this or in the bass range. That applies for both of them. Then we have the same thing, B minor and C minor. This time the given melody is in the bass voice, and you have the option to write above it in your tenor voice or above it in your soprano voice. Okay, now just some things to think about. Try to practice audiation, as suspensions are going to give a great opportunity to internalize the quality of dissonant intervals. So try to be able to hear in your head what you're seeing. This can also help by just following along. Listening to a score while also looking at the score at the same time can prove very helpful, because then you can learn how to train how what you're seeing is going to hear directly in the moment. So instead of trying to challenge yourself too much, try to make it easy and efficient. Suspensions are something that occur in a lot of music, so it shouldn't be that hard to find suspensions in real music. And also, at the end of this, if you can't find anything like that, I'll just have each 6 of those exercises by those different composers played, so then you can maybe use that if you want as a practice of seeing the suspensions and hearing them at the same time. Okay, so that'll be at the very end. So outside of these exercises, thinking about suspensions, you're still going to be thinking about the PSR, prepare, suspend, and resolve, but we're going to be thinking about chords. So it's the same thing where P must form a consonance with the chord at the time. It's going to prepare the suspension. S must be the same note as P, so that's the suspended note it's suspending, and it is suspending into the next chord instead of just the next interval. And furthermore, in the PSR, normally S, we think of it as a dissonance that's used in the dissonant suspensions, but in chords, all the S is a non-chordal tone. So it's a note that's not a 1, 3, 5, or 7 in the chord. Perhaps just thinking about the 1, 3, and the 5. But of course not including the upper extensions, so the 9, 11, and 13. Or in more classical thinking, the 2, 4, and 6. Because especially when actually scoring this on the staff for a player to be able to read, this can communicate which note above the root note is to be played. An upper extension of that. So an octave and then that note. Versus thinking of an 11th or a 13th where the player would have to think, okay, what interval above the note is this? Depending on the player, how they're trained, what they're used to, this could serve as a more efficient way to read it. So of course, because we're thinking about chords here, when your suspended note S resolves, it's resolving to a consonant chord tone. So again, this could be your 1, 3, 5, or 7. So it's good to know PSR because it can be used outside of these exercises, even in non-contrapuntal music. For example, suspending a note in a chord into the next chord where it clashes and creates a dissonance. Then that suspended note moves a step to a note in the chord, harmonizing with it. Okay, so the last thing that I'd want to mention is that you might want to use method 1 and 2 to compose these and see how they turn out, listen to them, and see which one you think might be better. Because some people advocate to try to create a chain of dissonances where the resolution of one dissonant interval is just the preparation of another dissonant interval. And with that, you could also just see how the two methods are different. Maybe one of them's not worse than the other, maybe they're just different. And with that, you'd have two different methods of creating different sounds and different realizations for a counterpoint or maybe a contrapuntal situation that has bad voice leading that you're trying to overcome somehow, because again, that's what the dissonant suspension can be very useful for. So that's the end of all this. Remember that suspensions are one thing that many people tend to skip over and not study very much. So then this leads them to not use them very much, if at all. They are very useful, and it should be noted that they can create a sense of sophisticated elegance in a passage. So make sure you do some practice exercises for these, and they will become yet another tool that you can use as a composer. Learn to see the suspension in scores, hear them in music, and be able to sing them or play them on an instrument or both. And if you can, try to be able to see a suspension written in a score and hear it in your head how it would sound played by an instrument. Okay, so that's it for this video. If you haven't checked out or need a refresher on everything else leading up to this, then check out my counterpoint playlist, and you'll see videos from a very introduction to counterpoint, furthermore into each video on the different species, also one on 3-to-1 counterpoint. So check those out. And there's also other additional videos on there explaining the difference between tonal and modal counterpoint, showing some exercises and some common mistakes in them, and other things having to do with voice leading and counterpoint in that playlist. I'll see you on the next video, where we will combine everything from all these videos into making a free counterpoint over a given melody, known as florid counterpoint. If you found this video helpful, be sure to give it a thumbs up. Love to hear a comment, what you thought of it, any questions. And until next time, bye.